Africa has 54 countries today. Almost every single one of those borders is a straight line drawn by men who had never set foot on the continent. They drew those lines in roughly 50 years, and the millions of people actually living on that land, nobody asked them. Nobody warned them. One morning, a farmer in West Africa woke up to find his village had been sliced in half by a country that did not exist the day before. His brother now lived in France. His cousin now lived in Britain. He himself lived in Germany. He had not moved an inch. How did this happen? How did an entire continent get carved up like a birthday cake by people sitting 4,000 miles away? To figure that out, we need to go back to a snowy night in Berlin in 1884, where 14 men with enormous mustaches sat around a table staring at a giant map of Africa. But first, we need to understand why they were even in that room. Because in 1870, Europeans controlled only about 10% of Africa. By 1914, they controlled 90%. That is not a slow takeover. That is a stampede. And it all started because of one tiny stretch of jungle nobody in Europe had ever heard of, called the Congo. In the early 1800s, Africa was a complete mystery to Europe. Sure, they had trading posts along the coast, where they had spent centuries doing terrible things involving the slave trade. But the interior, total blank space on their maps. Europeans called it the Dark Continent. Not because of the people, but because they literally could not see inside it. Every explorer who tried to walk in came back sick, came back dead, or did not come back at all. Malaria killed Europeans faster than bullets. Then in the 1850s, something changed. A Scottish missionary named David Livingstone started walking across Africa with a Bible and a notebook. He kept walking and walking. For 30 years he mapped rivers, lakes and waterfalls, sending letters home that read like adventure novels. People in London ate it up. A young reporter in New York is sitting in his editor's office, getting the strangest assignment of his life. The editor leans forward and says, "Find Livingstone." The reporter blinks. "Find him where?" The editor shrugs. "Africa, just go." And the reporter walks out, packs a trunk, and disappears into the jungle for 2 years. That reporter's name was Henry Morton Stanley, and what he found would change everything. Stanley spent 2 years tramping through swamps, fighting off mosquitoes, and burying members of his expedition one by one. Then, in November 1871, he walked into a tiny village on the shore of Lake Tanganyika and saw an old white man standing there, pale and skinny and barely alive. Stanley walked up, tipped his hat, and said the most famous sentence in exploration history. "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" Livingstone smiled and said yes. They shook hands. Newspapers around the world exploded. Suddenly, Africa was the most exciting place on Earth. Every European country wanted a piece. But one man wanted more than a piece. He wanted the whole jungle. His name was King Leopold the Second of Belgium, and he was, to put it gently, a nightmare in a crown. Leopold ruled a tiny country smaller than the state of Maryland. He was obsessed, completely obsessed, with the idea that Belgium needed a colony, a big one. His advisors kept telling him no, Belgium was too small, too poor, too late. Every good piece of land was already being grabbed by Britain and France. So Leopold came up with a sneaky plan. He would pretend to be a humanitarian. He hired Stanley, the same reporter who found Livingstone, and sent him back to the Congo with a suitcase full of treaties. The deal was simple. Stanley would walk up to African chiefs, hand them some cloth or a few beads, and ask them to sign a piece of paper. The chiefs could not read the paper. The paper, written in French and English, said the chief was giving Leopold every inch of his land forever. Stanley signed about 450 of these treaties. Leopold now claimed an area 76 times the size of Belgium. In a wood-paneled office in Brussels, an advisor is trying to explain this to a confused British diplomat. So the king owns the Congo personally? Yes, not Belgium him. Correct. He just owns a chunk of Africa the size of Western Europe. He bought it fair and square, beads and cloth. Beads and cloth for an area the size of Western Europe. He is a very good negotiator. The other European powers looked at this and lost their minds. If little Belgium could grab a jungle the size of Western Europe, what was stopping anybody? The race was on. And to stop it from turning into a continent-sized brawl, somebody needed to call a meeting. That somebody was a German named Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany, a giant of a man with a walrus mustache, 3 chins, and a brain that worked like a chess computer. He was the most feared politician in Europe, and honestly, he did not even care about Africa. Germany barely had any colonies, but Bismarck cared deeply about one thing: stopping a war between Britain and France. Because if those two giants went to war over African dirt, all of Europe would burn. So in November 1884, Bismarck sent out invitations. Come to Berlin. Bring your maps. We are going to settle this peacefully. 14 countries showed up. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Russia, Austria, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the United States, and the Ottoman Empire. Notice anything missing from that list? Yeah, not a single African was invited. Not one chief, not one king, not one delegate from any African nation. They were dividing an entire continent, and the people who lived there were not even told the meeting was happening. The diplomats gathered in a fancy ballroom on Wilhelmstrasse. A massive map of Africa was unrolled across a long table. The map was mostly blank. Europeans still had no clue what was in the middle of the continent. There were no roads, no measurements, no detailed surveys, just empty space with the names of a few rivers scribbled in. And these men were about to draw the borders of a continent on a map that did not even show what was there. A waiter in the Berlin ballroom is refilling coffee cups and listening to the conversation. He overhears a French diplomat say, "Give us everything west of this river." A British diplomat says, "Fine, but we want everything east of this lake." The waiter looks down at the map and notices the river and the lake are not even on the same continent shape he learned in school. He shrugs, refills the coffee, and goes back to the kitchen to tell the cook that the future of Africa is being decided by men who clearly need a nap. The conference lasted 3 months. They argued, they smoked, they ate enormous dinners, and they drew lines. Long, straight, ruler-perfect lines straight through forests, mountains, rivers, and tribes that had existed for 1,000 years. By February 1885, the Berlin Conference was over. The diplomats rolled up the map, shook hands, and went home. On paper, Africa had been peacefully divided. In reality, they had just lit the fuse on the biggest land grab in human history. The conference produced one main rule, and this rule changed everything. The rule was called effective occupation. It said that to claim a piece of African land, you could not just point at it on a map. You had to actually go there, plant a flag, build a fort, and prove you controlled it. If you did not occupy it, somebody else could take it. This sounded reasonable in a Berlin ballroom. On the ground in Africa, it triggered a full-blown sprint. Every European power suddenly had a deadline. Get there first, or lose forever. Soldiers, surveyors, missionaries, and businessmen were shoved onto ships and pointed toward the African coast. The race had a name. Historians call it the Scramble for Africa, and Scramble is exactly what it was. Imagine 70 children at a birthday party and somebody dumps 1,000 pieces of candy on the floor. That was Europe in 1885. France went west, grabbing huge chunks of the Sahara and the lands south of it. They wanted a belt of territory stretching all the way from Senegal on the Atlantic coast to Djibouti on the Red Sea. Britain went the other way. They wanted a strip running from Cairo in the north all the way down to Cape Town in the south. North to south, top to bottom. The Cape to Cairo dream. The problem was, those two plans crossed each other. Right in the middle of Africa, the French belt and the British strip were going to slam into each other like two trains on the same track. A British officer stationed in Egypt is sitting at his desk staring at a telegram. The telegram says, "March south immediately. Claim everything you can." He looks at his small group of soldiers. He looks at the map. He looks at the desert outside his window. He sighs, takes a long sip of tea, packs his trunk, and starts walking south into a continent he has never seen before. Thousands of men just like him were doing the exact same thing. While Britain and France were stretching their arms across Africa, smaller players were grabbing whatever they could reach. Germany snatched up 4 chunks, a piece in the east called Tanganyika, a piece in the southwest called Namibia, a piece in the west called Cameroon, and a piece called Togo. Italy grabbed parts of the Horn of Africa, Somalia and Eritrea, and tried very hard to grab Ethiopia. We will come back to Ethiopia in a moment, because what happened there is one of the wildest stories on the continent. Portugal. which had been on the African coast for 400 years, finally pushed inland and claimed Angola on the west and Mozambique on the east. Spain took a few small slices in the northwest. And Leopold, the King of Belgium, sat in his palace stroking his beard and watching his private jungle grow. But here is where the story gets dark, really dark, because effective occupation did not just mean planting a flag. It meant forcing the people who already lived there to obey. And the methods Europeans used were, in many cases, monstrous. Leopold's Congo became the worst example. To make money, Leopold needed rubber. Rubber trees grew wild in the Congo jungle. Leopold ordered every village to deliver a quota of rubber every month. If a village fell short, his soldiers would cut off the hands of the workers, sometimes the hands of the workers' children. Historians estimate that under Leopold's rule, the population of the Congo dropped by roughly 10 million people through murder, starvation, and disease. A young Belgian clerk sitting in an office in the Congo is keeping the books. He notices the rubber numbers are perfect every month. He also notices the basket of severed hands sitting outside his window, which the soldiers used to prove they enforced the quota. He writes a letter to his mother in Brussels. He tells her he wants to come home. He never sends the letter. He buries it in a drawer and keeps working. When word of this leaked out in Europe, even other colonial powers were horrified. Eventually, in 1908, the Belgian government took the Congo away from Leopold and ran it themselves. Was it much better? Not really, but the worst of the rubber terror ended. Meanwhile, far to the east, one African nation was about to do something nobody saw coming. That nation was Ethiopia. And the story of how Ethiopia kept its independence is the story of the most embarrassing day in Italian military history. In the 1890s, Italy was the new kid in the colonial game. They had grabbed Eritrea and Somalia, but they wanted more. They wanted Ethiopia. The mountains were full of gold rumors. The land was rich, and on the map, Ethiopia sat right between two pieces of Italian territory, just begging to be connected. So Italy made a move. They sent a treaty to the Ethiopian emperor, a man named Menelik II. The treaty was written in two languages, Italian and Amharic. And here is the trick. The Italian version said Ethiopia was a protectorate of Italy. The Amharic version said Ethiopia could ask Italy for help if it wanted to. Two completely different deals on one piece of paper. Menelik was not stupid. He read both versions. He noticed the trick. He sent a polite letter to Rome saying, basically, nice try. The deal is off. Italy lost their minds. They declared they were going to march in and take Ethiopia by force. They sent an army, about 17,000 Italian soldiers with modern rifles and cannons. Menelik called every chief and prince in Ethiopia to bring their warriors. Raised an army of about 100,000 men. The two armies met on March 1st, 1896, at a place called Adwa. A young Italian soldier is sitting on a rock the morning of the battle, eating bread and writing a letter to his sister. He writes that he expects to be home in Rome by summer. He writes that the Africans cannot possibly stand up to European weapons. He folds the letter, tucks it in his pocket, and picks up his rifle. By sunset, that letter is lying in the dirt. The Italian army had been crushed. About 7,000 Italians were dead. 3,000 more were captured. It was a complete disaster. Ethiopia became the only African nation to defeat a European power in a full battle during the Scramble. Menelik did not even try to invade Italy back. He just sent the Italian prisoners home and said, "Leave us alone." And for the most part, they did. Ethiopia stayed independent. A small island of African self-rule in a continent now almost entirely owned by Europe. By 1914, the map of Africa was almost complete. Almost every inch of the continent was painted in the colors of European empires. Britain pink, France blue, Germany green, Portugal purple, Belgium orange, Italy yellow, Spain a small dash of red. Only Ethiopia and a tiny country called Liberia remained independent. Liberia had been founded in the 1820s by freed American slaves, and the United States quietly protected it, which kept European powers from grabbing it. Everything else was carved up. About 30 years of arguing in Berlin ballrooms and marching through jungles, and the continent looked completely different. But here is the part that matters most for our story. Those borders the Europeans drew did not follow rivers. They did not follow mountains. They did not follow the lines where different African peoples actually lived. They followed treaties signed in Europe. They followed straight lines drawn with rulers. They followed compromises between French and British diplomats sitting on opposite sides of a polished wooden table. Look at a map of Africa today. Count the straight lines. Egypt and Sudan, ruler straight. Algeria and Mali, ruler straight. Namibia and Botswana, ruler straight. Real borders do not look like that. Real borders wiggle along rivers and mountain ranges. Africa's borders look like somebody used a ruler in a Berlin ballroom, because that is exactly what happened. A village elder somewhere in West Africa is sitting under a tree explaining things to his grandson. He points at the path that leads out of the village. He says, "Beyond that path, my brother lives. He is now in a country called Niger. Beyond that hill, your aunt lives. She is now in a country called Nigeria. Beyond the river, your cousins live. They are in a country called Cameroon. We are the same people. We speak the same language, but we now live in 3 different countries because of men we have never met." The grandson asks why. The elder looks up at the sky and says, "Because in a city called Berlin, somebody had a ruler." Those border lines split apart ethnic groups that had lived together for centuries. They also smashed together ethnic groups who had been enemies for centuries. In the same colony, under the same flag, with the same passport, this was a recipe for trouble. And in about 50 years, that trouble would explode. But before we get to the explosion, we need to talk about how Europeans actually ran these colonies. Because the way they ran them is the reason everything fell apart later. Different countries had different styles. France believed in something they called assimilation. The idea was, turn Africans into French people. Teach them French in school, make them salute the French flag, make them sing French songs about French history. A boy in a village in Senegal would sit in a classroom and recite, "Our ancestors, the Gauls, had blue eyes and blonde hair." His ancestors had been African farmers for 10,000 years, but the textbook said Gauls, so he said Gauls. Britain took the opposite approach. They called it indirect rule. The idea was, find a local chief, hand him a fancy uniform, and let him do the dirty work. The British would sit in a nice house and collect taxes. The chief would deal with the actual people. This sounded clever, but it had a brutal side effect. Britain often picked the wrong chief, or invented a chief where there had never been one, or favored one ethnic group over another. In Rwanda, the Belgians, who took over from the Germans after World War I, picked the Tutsi people as the ruling class and pushed down the Hutu people. They even issued identity cards labeling everybody as Tutsi or Hutu. Before the Belgians, these labels had been fluid, almost like social classes you could move between. After the Belgians, they were fixed, permanent, and full of hatred. A Hutu farmer in Rwanda in the 1930s is standing in a government office getting his new identity card. The Belgian official measures his nose with a small ruler, measures the length of his fingers, looks at the color of his skin, then writes Hutu on the card. The farmer looks at the card. He does not understand what just happened. He is the same person he was before he walked in, but now, on paper, he is a different category of human. And in 60 years, that category will get his grandchildren killed. Portugal ran their colonies with brute force. Germany lost theirs after World War I, and they were split up between Britain, France, Belgium, and South Africa. Belgium kept squeezing the Congo for diamonds, copper, and rubber. Every system was different, but every system shared one thing. Every system was designed for Europeans to get rich and Africans to do the work. That was the whole point. And for about 50 years, the system worked, at least for the Europeans. Then the world changed. World War II changed everything. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain and France called on their African colonies to help fight Germany and Italy. Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers were shipped to Europe, to North Africa, to Asia. They fought in the deserts of Libya. They fought in the jungles of Burma. They liberated French villages from Nazi occupation. They saw Paris. They saw London. They saw white soldiers running away in fear. They saw white civilians begging for food. And they thought, wait a minute. These are the people who told us they were our natural superiors. When the war ended in 1945, those soldiers came home. They had seen the world. They had carried rifles. They had bled for empires that still treated them like second-class people in their own countries. Something snapped. Across Africa, men and women started organizing. Lawyers, teachers, journalists, former soldiers, all asking the same question. Why are we still ruled by people from across the sea? A young man in Ghana named Kwame Nkrumah is standing in front of a crowd of thousands. He has just come home from studying in America and Britain. He looks at the British flag flying over the government building behind him. He raises his voice and says, "We prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility." The crowd goes wild. Within a few years, he will be in prison. A few years after that, he will be the leader of an independent country. Britain and France looked at the costs. Running colonies was expensive. They were broke after the war. The Americans, who were now the world's superpower, were pressuring them to let the colonies go. The Soviet Union was offering African independence movements money and weapons, and the Africans themselves were not going to stop asking. So one by one, the empires started to fold. In 1956, Sudan became independent. In 1957, Ghana followed. In 1960 alone, 17 African countries declared independence. They called it the Year of Africa. By 1980, almost every European flag in Africa had been pulled down. The colonies were over. But the borders, those ruler-straight Berlin borders, those stayed. And here is the final twist of this whole story. When the new African leaders sat down to build their countries, they had a choice. They could keep the colonial borders, those messy ruler-straight lines that split families and crammed enemies together, or they could redraw the map, maybe make borders that actually matched where people lived. In 1963, the leaders of the newly independent African nations met in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. They formed the Organization of African Unity. And they made a decision that shaped the next 60 years. They agreed to keep the colonial borders exactly as they were. Why? Because the alternative was chaos. If every country started redrawing borders to match ethnic groups, every country would go to war with its neighbors. Imagine 50 civil wars at once. So they froze the lines, Berlin's lines, the lines drawn by men with mustaches who had never seen Africa. Those lines became permanent. And the consequences played out exactly as you might expect. In Nigeria, the Igbo people in the southeast tried to break away in 1967 to form a country called Biafra. The civil war killed roughly 1 million people, many of them children who starved to death. In Sudan, the Arab North and the African South fought each other for decades until South Sudan finally split off in 2011. In Rwanda in 1994, the Hutu and Tutsi divisions the Belgians had carved into identity cards exploded into a genocide that killed roughly 800,000 people in 100 days. A grandmother in a village somewhere in Africa is sitting with her grandchildren after dinner. They ask her why the borders are the way they are. She thinks for a long time. Then she says, "A long time ago, men in a cold city far away rolled out a map. They drew lines they thought were neat. They did not know about us. They did not ask about us, and those lines are still here." The grandchildren are quiet. Then the smallest one asks, "Can we change them?" The grandmother smiles softly. She says, "Maybe one day, but first you have to understand them." That is how Africa got its borders, 50 years of Europeans with rulers, and a continent still living with the consequences. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, share with a friend, and comment with the country you are watching from.